们再说到中国的经济问题啊，我们谈了人事，再来看一看经济的底层问题。近期啊，有关于中国经济又不行了，快崩溃了，已经走到尽头了呀。那么这样的这个悲观情绪啊是非常之多。同时啊，我们在这个真正的数据层面又看到了一些让大家觉得有希望啊、有亮点的所在。黑暗的隧道是不是走到尽头呢？当然，现在你光看1个月的数据还为时过早，至少啊，人家说3个月3个点，你才能看出到底是向上还是向下啊。所以咱们稍安勿躁，还不能说中国的经济形势到底如何。但是在对于中国经济问题的分析的时候啊，近期啊，这个和平先生在节目中提到过啊，一些真正的经济学者也提出了一个观点，就是外界呀，特别是媒体，很多时候呢，对于中国的经济形势的判断啊，是存在一个我们叫做不能说是刻意的夸大，但是呢，有的时候就是我们叫做操之过急，就下了一个结论。真实的情况可能比我们想象的要更富层次和复杂。之前啊，有观众朋友们特别注意到了我们华尔街电视为大家分享的哈佛大学的经济学讲座啊，是由 Gavekal 的创始人和现在的一位主要的高层管理者 Arthur Kruber 所进行的一个讲座，中国经济的真实状况。他在这样的一个讲座中呢，就破除了现在外界对于中国经济的几重迷思，包括中国的债务已经是一次2008年式的金融风险风暴到来之前的状况啊，习近平呢国进民退，私营企业要被卸磨杀驴，中国要重回大锅饭时代等等等等。对于这样的一些看法呢，他不仅仅提出的是像我们这样一些直觉上的分析到底是对是错，他还具体拿出了数据。那么这个讲座播出了之后啊，反响也非常的好，很多观众朋友们啊，也对于这位讲者对于中国经济的分析点头称道。今天在稍后的思想先驱报中啊，我们就再为大家回顾 Arthur Kruber 先生在哈佛大学的这个讲座啊，中国的信心危机到底是怎样的一重危机？为什么他判断习近平想搞的并不是国进民退，其实也不是经济发展不再重要，安全问题优先？到底想搞的是一个什么样的模式呢？用他的话说，叫做列宁主义的德国模式。这到底是怎样的一种经济发展理念？在思想先驱报，稍后我们会为大家介绍。今天中午12点，在华尔街电视为大家现场直播，请届时关注。节目最后，感谢给我们打赏的观众朋友们，感谢金山，感谢甜点。稍后华尔街联报继续为大家带来过去24小时的要闻评论以及更多精彩内容。
观众朋友，大家好，欢迎收看今天的新风视线。中国如今在全球电动汽车转型中所处的主导地位，可以说是与欧美地缘政治紧张关系中的最新根源。美国和欧洲的政策制定者为了避免对中国的长期依赖，都面临着代价高昂的努力。9月份，欧盟对中国对电动汽车的补贴开始展开调查，称中国廉价电动车正在欧洲涌入市场，从而加剧了这种紧张局势。彭博社最近对全球新能源行业的数据进行了评估，分析说明了为什么中国在全球电动车领域的王者地位将难以撼动。西方想要建立自给自足，或者更现实的说，仅仅是减少对中国的依赖，就将非常困难。首先，中国对全球电池生产有着极大的主导地位，导致全球汽车制造商严重依赖中国的合作伙伴。中国的电池制造商供应着全球约80%的电池，并且中国手中掌握着越来越多的采矿业和加工链，成为中国生产电池的强有力的后盾。想要彻底切断中国的供应链是不可能的。在这张图中，我们可以看到浅绿色的代表中国，在电动汽车的整个产业链中，最左边的采矿业已经是中国控制最少的领域，但是中国对非洲锂矿和印尼镍生产商的投资仍然使中国占据重要地位。现在通用汽车等美国大型汽车制造商也加入了这一领域的投资热潮。而供应链的中游、加工精炼，西方国家更加难以打破中国的垄断地位。中国花了数十年的时间建立了自己在这一领域的权威。国际能源署称，中国加工了全球1半以上的锂，2/3的钴， 70%以上的石墨和1/3的镍。加工过程通常是污染严重，并且会产生有毒废物。西方国家对开采原材料和制造电动汽车的环境成本也越来越严格的审查，这使得供应链这一步的审批流程变得更加复杂而且耗时。而中国真正体现实力的地方是电池组件，也就是电池工作所必须的4个关键部件。中国拥有着全球约70%的阴极产能和超过80%的阳极产能，还有超过1半的电解液和隔膜产量。这些部件组合在一起就能制成锂离子电池。这种电池目前超过3/4是在中国制造的，而且主要是由2家公司来制造，也就是宁德时代和比亚迪。拥有庞大的制造基础设施，加上中国政府愿意每年花费数十亿美元的慷慨补贴和其他支持，使中国成为了世界上最大的电动汽车市场。在中国的一些城市，电动汽车销量已经接近整体汽车销量的1/3，这也意味着西方国家陷入了追赶的困境。就欧盟而言，欧盟既需要实现世界上最难的气候目标，又同时要应对27个不同国家的复杂官僚体系。欧盟委员会主席冯德莱恩表示，中国汽车充斥着全球电动汽车市场，因为它可以所谓的人为压低的价格来出售电动车。而彭博社则指出，这一切都与电池有关，因为电池是电动汽车中成本最高的部分，也是中国最能利用其规模经济的部分。根据彭博社的计算，中国电池组的成本价格为每千瓦时127美元，而北美和欧洲的价格分别要高出24%和33%，这使得电池工厂成为推动供应链多元化的资本最密集的部分。彭博社计算，在美国和欧洲最大的汽车市场德国，仅建设一座磷酸铁锂电池工厂就需要花费约8.65亿美元，而相比之下，中国建造一座类似的电池工厂只需要花费6.5亿美元，这在很大程度上归功于中国的建筑和劳动力成本较低。而从更广泛的角度来看，到2030年，欧洲和美国将分别需要花费980亿美元和820亿美元用于电池精炼到电池制造设施。欧盟估计到2030年，整个产业链还需要花费3820亿欧元才能够实现自给自足。除了高昂的价格标签，对中国的调查还可能产生深远的影响，加剧欧洲的困境。如果欧盟对来自中国的进口商品征收关税，人们普遍预计北京将会采取报复性措施，报复目标可以从奢侈品行业到稀土等等一系列的行业，稀土也是对电动汽车至关重要的元素。目前进入欧洲的中国电动汽车需要缴纳10%的关税。北京对外经济贸易大学的教授赵永胜表示，10%左右的关税是可以接受的，但是如果提高到接近25%，将会令谈判破裂。赵永胜说，如果谈判能够停留在技术和理性层面，而不是政治因素，中国可以实现10%左右的关税。但是随着全球迎来一个贸易保护主义的新时代，电池和电动汽车行业的长期发展轨迹可能会比一味追求完全自给自足更加的微妙。首先，西方摆脱中国的努力与中国进一步发挥主导地位的努力是同时进行的。中国的电动汽车行业走在技术创新的前沿，电池制造商已经开始推出使用钠而不是锂的新一代电池。而从短期来看，中国经济放缓使国内电动汽车需求不稳定，因此中国的汽车制造商越来越多地将目光投向海外市场。最终，欧盟的调查甚至可能会加强中国在欧盟地区的投资。中国企业也在加大力度进军韩国电池行业，以利用韩国与美国的自由贸易协定，并且提高中国获得税收减免资格的可能性。分析师表示，欧盟现在无法对中国汽车制造商进入欧洲采取任何措施，因为电池供应链完全由中国人控制。对中国进口电动汽车征收任何关税都将是一件大事，而且有几家中国公司现在也持有欧洲制造商的股份，其中包括一些业内知名的企业，比如说宁德时代正在提高其位于德国的电池工厂的产量，并且正在匈牙利建设另外一家工厂。而长城汽车旗下的电池制造商蜂巢能源则计划将其在欧洲的业务扩展到多达5家工厂，并且已经在与欧洲的汽车制造商谈判电池供应的事宜。彭博社报道，欧盟承诺从2035年起禁止销售所有新的汽油和柴油汽车，这也增强了欧盟的压力。 而定于2024年中期举行的欧洲议会选举将会使中国的电动汽车主导成为焦点。这意味着欧盟的领导人需要谨慎平衡政治与迫切需要的气候议题。中国最大的电池回收企业之一格林美的副总裁张玉平表示，归根结底，新能源产业的发展需要不同环节、不同国家的协调，与中国隔离或者说设置障碍是不会有帮助的。他表示，如果各国能够相互谈判、协调合作，那是最好的结局。以上就是今天新风视线的全部内容，感谢您的收看。如果喜欢，记得点赞并且订阅我们的频道。我们下期节目再见。
Kurt Campbell is the Deputy Assistant to the President and the White House Coordinator for Indo-Pacific Affairs. China Talk recently joined Campbell in Washington to discuss U.S.-China relations. Jordan Schneider, how do you conceptualize comprehensive national power today? How has your vision of that changed over time? Kurt Campbell, it's a challenging question. Obviously, I think particularly when you're in a period in which you're comparing great powers in terms of their ability to exert themselves on the international stage, I think in those environments, it's not possible to simply look at any one venue of power. I would argue that to be effective in today's age, it requires not just military power. I think too often when we discuss power in the United States, we're often thinking about military power. But increasingly that definition has to do with the health of our society, the health of our democracy, our investment in education, our ability to lead the world in innovation, technology, and not just one technology, but several. I think by those metrics, the United States stacks up well. But there clearly are some warning signs in areas where the United States has to be attentive. I think one of the things that the Biden administration has tried to do is to recognize some of those areas, invest in them, and try to double down on ensuring that the United States continues to play a leading role. Jordan Schneider, so let's set a baseline goal for U.S. policy in 2050. Michael Green says the traditional U.S. aim is to oppose any power exercising hegemonic control over Asia or the Pacific. Or we can take your slightly more ambitious view that the U.S. should sustain the operating system that it has set up in Asia over the past 75 years. My rubric for the three things the U.S. needs to execute on are long-term economic growth, maintaining alliance networks, and not imploding domestically. Plus, we have a major war as a potential wildcard there. What am I missing in this schematic? Kurt Campbell, I think that's a good list. I don't think what Mike presents and what I do are inconsistent. I think there's a lot of overlap. I would just add one thing to this if I can. I recognize that for people who think about power, sometimes they don't like the intrusion of issues that are not traditional. But in fact, if we don't figure out how to consequentially deal with climate change, the effects of which are hitting us much earlier, in a much more profound way than I think even some of the worriers thought, I don't think we'll be able to deal with some of these other challenges. So I think what I'd add to that probably are some transnational issues. But at the top of that really would be climate change. That means sea level rise, that means uncontrolled migration, that means changes in everything from crops to sea habitats. These are all at risk now, much earlier than anticipated. That's one of the things that requires the United States working more consequentially with not just allies and partners, but other countries that we have disagreements with. I think in truth, we have been loathed. We try not to call out particular countries, but China is going to have to do much more in this arena if we are to address the most significant elements of climate change over the course of the next period ahead. Jordan Schneider, over the past few years, have you revised your expectations on China's comprehensive national power? Kurt Campbell, I'm not sure necessarily revised, but refined. I think what has been brought clear to us over the course of the last little while is when you deal with people who have long experience with China, either in the business realm or elsewhere, they will often say things like, the Chinese or China is a practical nation, and they will often find their way to practical solutions. I think my recent experience, at least with the top level of leadership, would suggest that even more than practical or specific steps, ideology is at the core of what drives China today. You cannot understand or engage effectively without an understanding about how important ideology is to Xi Jinping and his lieutenants. as far as possible on AI and chips? Jordan Schneider, so almost a year ago today, your boss, Jake Sullivan, announced that the US was now aiming to maintain as large of a lead as possible in critical emerging technologies like AI and semiconductors. Is that still policy today? Kurt Campbell, I think our policy continues to be one that we need and will continue to invest in critical technologies and, where possible, make sure that we have a competitive edge and to do some of that with allies and partners. So yes, I do think we recognize and believe that. Again, to your first question, one of the core elements of comprehensive national power is the ability to set standards, create market share, and innovate at the highest levels with respect to critical technologies. The two critical technologies that you mentioned are only two of many in which the United States, I think I would argue, needs to continue to invest, be disciplined about, and focus on. Jordan Schneider, which risk profile to you is scarier? The one in which the US is too tight or too loose with its export controls and other restrictions around these critical technologies? Kurt Campbell, that's a very sort of up or down question. It's complicated, but if you're forcing me to answer, I would probably be more worried about too loose. But I would just point out that much of our international system over decades has been designed such that, at its core, our efficiencies and lowest costs for production, accepting certain capabilities and technologies, are better done in some places than others. Right? But I think we're probably heading into a new period where a new set of calculus is important: resilience, durability, the opportunity to be able to count on more than one source of supply. All those steps build redundancy into the system. I think probably those steps are smart and they will continue. But it is a substantial reorientation of the system that had been about just-in-time, that had been about maximizing efficiency over resiliency. I think we're reorienting towards a system that's more predictable. It may be higher cost in certain areas, maybe slightly slower, but we think we'll probably be more durable in event of a crisis. Jordan Schneider, Huawei recently announced it could fab a 7-nanometer chip. The way I read the October 2022 export controls, the line was set a little higher than that. How would you define success for these restrictions? Kurt Campbell, that differs according to various technologies more generally. With 5G, AI, and semiconductors, each of those have slightly different comparative assessments associated with them. I would say that the key here is that there are some technologies that we've innovated that we would prefer to inhibit from animating certain military and security capabilities in China. We've stated clearly, and I think we've taken steps to prevent the proliferation of some of those capabilities and technologies that will be challenging under the best of circumstances. Ultimately, what our technology frame has to be about is running faster, making the appropriate investments, the smart investments, to work more closely with allies and partners, and to realize that that is going to be an essential feature of global leadership. I think with the various initiatives involved with domestic investments in technology, that's exactly what the Biden administration has sought to do. There are active debates about how effective or successful certain kinds of limitations or steps designed to limit the outflow of technology to China can be. That's why, ultimately, the most important steps that we can take are about running faster, about investing in capabilities in the United States. I think those are steps that are generally widely appreciated. Historical parallels: the USSR and China. Jordan Schneider, I was pleasantly surprised to discover your first book was an archival history of relations between the Soviet Union and South Africa, of all things. Kurt Campbell, it's a bestseller. It's amazing you got a hold of it. Jordan Schneider, we have our ways here at China Talk. You made this interesting argument that the US bought into the National Party line, that they were about to succumb to a total onslaught. In fact, the US may be overweight the ideological bent of the Soviet Union's approach to South Africa and Africa more broadly. Compare that to Rush Doshi's book on China's grand strategy. How does the foreign policy of the late Soviet Union stack up against that of China today in terms of its ideological commitment to global preeminence? Kurt Campbell, there is an apple and oranges quality to trying to compare both the Cold War to this period of competition with China. But it is an interesting arena of thought to try to understand how important ideology is in various periods in particular regimes. My sense is that currently at the highest levels of China, again, I think an ideological frame is central to understanding them. I think they think in terms of correlations of power, periods of history, and often see the United States through that lens, late-stage capitalism and the like. I think in the 1970s and 1980s, I think there were clear signs inside the Soviet regime of the challenges that the country was facing. Remember, even though we may have got it wrong in the United States, I think internally they understood that they were not meeting their 5-year plans, that they were facing challenges about putting too much money into the military-industrial part of the economy, and they were not innovating in the way that was necessary. Some of the Soviet theorists on the military side worried about the kinds of investments that the United States was making and that the Soviets were not keeping up. A Soviet leader named Ogarkov thought about sort of what he referred to as the revolution in military affairs. I don't think the Chinese believe in any way that they have elements of decline in their system. I think what animates them is not only a sense of agreement at the highest level, the idea of reversing decades or a century of what they call humiliation, but also a sense that China's time has come, that this remarkable accumulation of power and capacity now has to exert itself fully to a leading role on the global stage. So it's hard to compare and contrast. But I will also say that you can sense in some of the interactions between President Xi and President Putin in Russia, even though Putin is running a country that theoretically is not ideological, he is a man of the Soviet era, and they both together bemoan the treachery of Mikhail Gorbachev. Chatham House. It's very clear that this early period of partnership between the Soviet Union and China, something that Xi Jinping's father was deeply involved in, clearly animates both of their psychologies. That's a long and not very good answer to a very good question. But I do think more time has to be given to sort of thinking about this role of ideology. I do think in various eras of Soviet power, beginning at the turn of the last century, they were more ambitious about internationalizing their model, obviously, the Communist International. I don't think there are signs of a similar kind of ideological international approach of China. I think in many respects, they feel that they are unique, and that can't be replicated. The steps that they've taken internationally have been to provide capacities, either technology or police services or whatever, at the behest of local authoritarians, whether it's in Africa or the Pacific or South Asia, to try to prop up leaders that tend to be more flexible on issues that matter to China. Rush Doshi's book is sensational. My Soviet policy towards South Africa is not. Jordan Schneider, hey, yours is like a 6.5 or 7 out of 10. Kurt Campbell, no, not really. I actually won an award several years ago in Britain. I remember I got a call about it and they said, congratulations. Soviet policy towards South Africa's won an award. I think, oh, terrific. What was it? It was like the book made most irrelevant by history. Jordan Schneider, ha. Kurt Campbell, no, seriously. Jordan Schneider, it's coming back. Kurt Campbell, no, it's not. Jordan Schneider, if you could assign Xi one book, what would it be? Kurt Campbell, let me just begin to broaden that question just a little bit. I think some of the things that we hear from people in China today suggests that the kind of information and the people that President Xi gets information from is increasingly limited and that sometimes it's hard in the system currently to speak truth to power. We are seeing a repeat of history of the kind that we saw in the Maoist period, where only a certain kind of leader, a certain kind of information makes it to the very top. So that does concern us, that you like very much for the people that you're engaging with to have a deep, full understanding of the world in which they're operating. I think what we see in a variety of places like Ukraine, we think China's calculus and decision-making has been informed by a number of things that are concerning. We can talk more about that as the interview goes on. When you asked me what I would want Xi to read, what would be one book or one article? I'd just like him to have a general library card where he could go in and get access to a variety of things and sort of double-check the information rosy often that he's receiving from his underlings and his staff. Jordan Schneider, the China we're seeing today, for all the objectionable things they're doing around the world, is very different than Mao making global revolution. That's a better thing for the world. How does this compare to the Cold War, And what can the U.S. do to shape contours of competition? Kurt Campbell, deterrence is a huge part of what we're involved in a variety of places, trying to make clear that provocative or adventurous activities that are antithetical to the maintenance of peace and stability will be resisted. It is true that there were periods that Mao talked openly about nuclear weapons use and was quite prepared to take risks, calculated risks often, but very much prepared to take those risks. I think President Xi, in certain circumstances, has shown a propensity to take certain risks, but also has been careful in other circumstances, and, if anything, I find elements of his approach not easy to predict. I wouldn't have anticipated, for instance, such a deep Chinese commitment to President Putin. It doesn't seem to me to be fundamentally in Chinese interests. But the more you understand the mindset of both leaders, I think you start to appreciate what animates that partnership. But a variety of things. In previous periods when I worked on China, I found that their diplomats were some of the most expert and capable in the world. They generally followed certain tenets that you could come to expect. So, for instance, when it became clear in the 1990s that some of the most important challenges for China would be from the sea, from their eastern seaboard, they quickly settled almost all their territorial disputes with the many countries that they bordered. What you generally saw was a China that would seek to take on one or two challenges and then try to either hold or settle so that they wouldn't find themselves operating simultaneously on several fronts at once. What's surprising and a little concerning is how China has been prepared to move out in a variety of circumstances against a number of countries in ways that I think create more unity of purpose for some of these countries. There are a number of countries that would prefer a different kind of relationship, but have found it difficult. I think India, for instance, wants a deeper technology partnership, but because of the steps that China has taken along the line of actual control in 2020 and before, it's made India much more resistant and reluctant to take those steps. It's again a very good, broad question. I'm struck personally by how much China in recent years has either intentionally or unintentionally alienated countries that otherwise would have preferred to partner with them. Image. Yang Jiechi in 2010, China is a big country and you are small countries, and that is a fact. Jordan Schneider, do you think Xi or the post-11 CCP would be content with living under an American operating system? Kurt Campbell, I actually would probably take issue with your question. I do not believe that what is being suggested or articulated is the idea of living under an American operating system. I would argue that if you look at the last 60 or 70 years, that operating system is complex. You've done your homework, so you know the pieces of it: peaceful resolution of disputes, open lines of communication, freedom of navigation, and all the different elements that go into that. I think I would argue that the last 70 or 80 years have been fantastic for Asia. In fact, I think you'd find people that would say, look, this operating system has been great for China, maybe not as great for us. We lost a lot of jobs, lost a lot of innovation during that period. I would probably try to push back against that. But I think there is an undeniable quality of Chinese growth and prosperity during this period. I think you could argue now this is largely due to the hard work of the Chinese people. But this larger context which we helped build, delivered for China some of the very best periods, decades in China's history. Now they would take full credit for that. But the truth is that the United States helped provide that context. So it's not as if this period has meant shackles for China. They have grown. They have developed. They have matured technologically in so many different ways. I don't think we're suggesting that the United States wants to somehow curtail all elements of Chinese growth. But what we're concerned about are some manifestations that seek to alter this system in ways that are antithetical to the interests of not just the United States, but all of these countries. Jordan Schneider, you recently said there's a danger in being a wildly ardent suitor when it comes to engagement. What's the bullish case for engagement? What can we realistically achieve in the next 18 months? Kurt Campbell, we believe that finding some careful arenas where the United States and China can work together, whether it's on fentanyl or certain elements in climate change. We could go through a list together. I think those things are areas that we'd like to see continue. We'd like very much some educational initiatives to continue. Just the general policy and practice of no surprises, I think, can be an effective ingredient in this era of diplomacy and statesmanship. I think continuing high-level engagement, practical areas of communication in an environment in which competition remains the dominant theme in our relationship is what we can hope for and work towards. I think that's what we will be inclined to do. There's a constant table setting in diplomacy with China, and I think there are certain things that, if you are involved in it, you see on a regular basis. One is that the idea that the ball is always in our court. We're always going to be the we ones that are going to have to take some steps. The other is that we want diplomacy more than they do, and that somehow that makes us needy. Now, the truth is that because we are and have been a great power in many respects, China is ascending to this. We actually take, frankly, more seriously some of the responsibilities of being a global power and the communication that we think is required in that evolution. I think we take that probably more serious than China. So we are quite keen on establishing certain military communications and other lines of interaction. But at the same time, I think allies and partners are unnerved if they feel that the United States is too enthusiastic about the need to settle down in some sort of discussions and that we will give away some things that will be important in deliberations. Much of that is a residue from an earlier period. I think we're likely heading into a different period in which there's less focus on who wants diplomacy more. Most of these countries want a predictable, steady degree of communication between the United States and China, sort of not too cold, not too hot. I think that probably is where the United States lands as well. I think the interesting question, and the one that we cannot answer, is that, currently in the recent period, China does seem interested and prepared to engage in diplomacy with the United States. But how long will that last? Jordan Schneider, is the concept of face in diplomacy a real thing, particularly in East Asia? I feel like Western politicians also get embarrassed. If Americans orientalize this concept, can Asian countries weaponize this and use it to manipulate us? Kurt Campbell, well, let me answer the first part of the question. Anyone who's worked in Asia understands that a huge element of diplomacy is the idea of face. In many respects, face can be more important than the actual reality of agreements reached or issues discussed. We see that in encounters not just with China, but with many countries in the Indo-Pacific. However, I think your first point is a wise one. Americans, other leaders have face too. They can be embarrassed, they can find themselves on the other ends of things that are difficult to explain. I find it interesting that oftentimes the interlocutors in China that are most focused on their face have less or lesser focus on ours. But the truth is that it goes both ways. I think an effective diplomacy would have several characteristics. One, I think, is that trying to avoid surprises is important, and probably, secondly, recognizing that there is a dignity to engagement and you have to show your counterpart appropriate respect. We're not always great at that, by the way. So this is, in many respects, aspirational. Jordan Schneider, speaking of interlocutors, parties come and go. You've had plenty of transitions in South Korea and the Philippines. You have new people to talk to. Is it weird when folks disappear on you? What does it mean? Kurt Campbell, I mean there's disappearing and there's disappearing. Right? So it is sometimes sad when you work closely with a counterpart and they either retire or go on to a new assignment. But oftentimes you see those people again. People who really work on the Indo-Pacific in these various places, when they retire, they often retire into positions in which they continue to be actively involved. Jordan Schneider, yeah, that's not quite what I was getting at. Kurt Campbell, I know. I get it. I'm trying to answer delicately your question. But there are probably a few senior people in the Chinese system I don't know if we'll ever see again. That is unusual, yes.
大家好，我是华尔街电视的小安，为大家主持一档新的节目《亚洲大眼睛》。什么样的内容，您慢慢看就知道了。那中国迎来11长假，中国游客赴东南亚旅游人次远不及冠病疫情发生之前，原因包括签证办理时间长、航班供给少、旅游成本激增以及治安考量。那东南亚不缺游客，不过少了中国游客。中国从9月29日起开始11长假，直至10月6日，期间横跨中秋节、11国庆两大节日，8天长假被称为黄金周，民众多在这个时间规划跨省出国旅游。东南亚过往多以中国为第一大客源国，然而这一次却未等到中国游客报复性出游。北京阳光假期国际旅行社负责人傅增就表示，受到签证办理时间长、航班供给少、目的地饭店与交通费用高、中文导游缺乏的因素影响，导致消费者对于东南亚旅游是咨询量多，成交量少。傅增就说，上半年东南亚旅游市场只恢复到冠病疫情前 25% 至 30%。以北京飞往泰国航班的恢复情况为例，目前每周只开通3班，而疫情前每天就有3趟航班。傅增就坦言，目前尚未能找回消费者，原因恐是出于民众对于花钱更加谨慎，这是出国旅游业遇寒风的主要关键原因。境外自由行服务品牌蓝猫旅行创办人赵俊就指出，东南亚治安状况为消费者是否前往旅游的重要考量。由于一些背景取材东南亚国家犯罪的电影，公司每天接到速通咨询电话问安全吗？尽管没有任何实例，消费者仍然未能放下安全顾虑。那中国观光客赴泰国锐减 75%。中国新闻周刊报道就引述相关数据指出，入境东南亚的中国游客在今年上半年只恢复到疫情前的一部分。泰国旅游和体育部公布数据，今年1月至7月，中国约有183万人次到访泰国，名列第2，不再是泰国最大的客源地。中国赴新加坡游客量在上半年为 42.4 万人次，仅恢复到2019年同期的 11.78%。东南亚不缺游客，只是少了中国游客。受到地区冲突、物价上涨影响，去年冬天到今年春节，大批欧洲人到东南亚避寒度假，常住半年，酒店、交通价格都被哄抬起来了。那暑假到来后，理应进入旺季的中国客源市场没有起色，在东南亚街头或沙滩仍然可见到许多亚洲面孔，不过这些大多都来自韩国及马来西亚。柬埔寨推 China Ready 计划，说中文等服务来抢华客。那为吸引中国民众前往柬埔寨旅游，柬埔寨旅游当局就启动了针对中国民众的在线旅游服务质量认证体系 China Ready， 以期加大吸引中国游客力道，帮助柬埔寨旅游经济复苏。根据中新社报道，柬埔寨计划今年能吸引80万至100万中国游客到访的目标。那此外还推出专门针对中国游客的定制服务 China Ready 白皮书计划，保障一线工作人员会说中文。那 China Ready 计划中包括了在酒店住宿服务、餐厅、导游等旅游从业者、旅行社、度假村、超市及纪念品商店等7个旅游服务领域推行5项定制标准。首先，当局保障一线工作人员会说中文，了解 China Ready 旅游战略，用数码化推广中文，且产品和标签也得使用中文，还有在为中国旅客提供标准化服务。报道就称，今年以来，柬埔寨加快 China Ready 认证体系的建设，通过旅游服务质量认证的旅游业经营者将颁获中国消费者信赖的服务和产品证书。根据统计数据显示，截至今年上半年为止，柬埔寨已经接待外国旅客共257万人次，其中泰国、越南和中国更是其外籍旅客的主要来源地。而今年上半年来，中国民众入境柬埔寨的人数约为26万8千人。柬埔寨旅游部官员就表示， China Ready 认证体系是为服务中国旅客而量身打造， 检方将借助中检友好年举办一系列活动，吸引更多中国游客。那负面报道重创柬埔寨旅游业，暹粒大型购物中心10月关闭。另一方面，柬埔寨旅游业受到负面新闻及中国游客减少的影响，暹粒的一家大型购物中心宣布将于10月停止营业。那大型购物中心 Lucky Mall 在商场外就放置了板块，通知顾客将于10月1日关闭。是次的决定相信与暹粒游客人数下降有关。那据高棉时报报道，商场关闭的原因是当前柬埔寨游客数量低迷，因为新冠疫情以及中国游客的减少，再加上不少关于柬埔寨的负面报道，导致中国游客取消前往柬埔寨的计划。该报道就指出，此前有多家外媒报道称，大量游客，尤其是中国游客，取消了前往柬埔寨的计划，因为柬埔寨被报道成国际诈骗和人口贩卖的温床，严重打击柬埔寨的形象。日经亚洲也曾经发表题为《柬埔寨诈骗名声吓跑中国游客》的文章。那柬埔寨成为网络诈骗团伙的避风港，团伙贩卖人口，从事强迫劳动，严重损害了柬埔寨在中国的声誉，影响着东南亚国家疫情后重建旅游业的努力。这些报道严重损害柬埔寨的声誉。直到目前为止，柬埔寨外国游客为主的中国游客仍然不敢前往柬埔寨旅游。高棉时报在过去2年也曾针对这些骗局进行报道。犯罪分子通常用高薪吸引受害者到柬埔寨工作，但在受害者抵达后，发现自己被迫从事在线赌博等非法活动，同时面临拘留和虐待。尽管柬埔寨旅游业已经恢复至疫情前的水平，但柬埔寨旅行社代表仍督促当局抵制这些负面指控。孤注一掷造成负面影响，柬埔寨政府禁止上映。那再来，柬埔寨就认为中国电影孤注一掷影响了柬埔寨旅游业，因此当地政府禁止电影在当地上映，同时致信于中国。根据简媒报道，柬埔寨文化和艺术部国务秘书兼发言人小组组长 He Sammet 就表示，该部从社媒上看到上述电影商业预告片后，认为严重影响柬埔寨声誉，因此决定立即采取行动。他指出，舆论认为这部中国电影使柬埔寨旅游业受到严重影响。这部电影影响了一个拥有完整主权的国家。他表示，这部电影是在我们不了解的情况下在外国拍摄的。当电影上映时，我们才知道，因此我们没有任何预防措施。他说，当政府见到预告片后，立刻要求观看完整版电影，发现当中受影响的国家不只是柬埔寨，几乎所有东盟成员国都受到影响。他强调，政府不允许这部电影在当地上映，禁止其在柬埔寨播出，不会签发播放许可证。若在社媒或其他媒体上看到，将会要求邮电部配合阻止电影传播，这是政府所能做的事情。简媒就表示，值得注意的是，中国电影孤注一掷引起柬埔寨民众的强烈反响。这部电影也因为中外游客的观看，而让柬埔寨旅游业陷入低迷，成为害怕去柬埔寨的源头。那根据观察，电影孤注一掷内有着大量柬埔寨元素，诈骗分子身上的衣服、大巴车上等等，赫然写着高缅字体。随着电影孤注一掷的上映，大量中国人就表示不敢再到柬埔寨、缅甸等地方旅游。那近日，微博就发起问卷调查，在58000条留言中，有44000条留言表示因为安全问题，会避免到缅甸和柬埔寨旅游。那只有这国人敢去柬埔寨。而另一方面，正当中国人对柬埔寨望而却步时，这个国家的游客却丝毫不畏惧，仍然前往柬埔寨旅游。这就是马来西亚。马来西亚威奇旅游有限公司董事经理潘伟文就表示，虽然国人被卖猪仔至柬埔寨事件闹得沸沸扬扬，但其公司的柬埔寨观光团相当瘦弱，在数个月前才组团前往柬埔寨，而现在又正接洽另一个团，这是某公司慰劳职员观光团，他们优先选择的地方是柬埔寨。他说，一般上只要组团的都是比较安全的，所以这些人前往柬埔寨观光是相对安全的。他说，旅行社在组团时会以专业的做法为顾客服务，例如在大马出发时将由领队带领， 抵达一个国家之后，将有当地旅行社接待，把众人起居饮食、交通安排得妥妥当当，顾客就负责吃喝玩乐就好。他说，领队们会再视该国度社会治安问题，提醒队友们做好应对方法，减少罪案的发生，例如小心扒手等等。他说自己在旅行社20多年，从未发生过有团友被拐骗事件。那应时代的需求，现今的旅行团已经没有以往购物团的浓烈色彩，已偏向观光而已。他说，猪仔事件不会影响旅行社组团前往柬埔寨的服务，但或许会影响自由行的旅人们。他们会考量猪仔案例而暂搁柬埔寨游。另外他说，猪仔事件也涉及柬埔寨三角洲的泰国和缅甸，但没影响其公司出团至清迈。到目前为止，每个月都会有顾客组团前往清迈清莱。那观众朋友们，您会到柬埔寨旅游吗？欢迎留言告诉我们。谢谢大家，这是第20期的亚洲大眼睛，希望听到您的意见。